Well, hello, everyone, and we thank you for tuning in for another session of our Bible study. As you can see, we're at our BBB setup, and you know what that means. We messed up on our recording, so I get to do this all over again in this setting. We do apologize for that, and unfortunately, that means you will not get the back and forth that we had going on in class, and we had some really good discussion going on with that, so very, very sorry that you won't be able to partake in that, but that's just more reason for you to come and visit with us if you're in the local area. That way you won't miss out on things like this. So last time we ended our Bible class discussion in John 18, verses 17 through 18. Then saith the damsel that kept the door unto Peter, Art not thou also one of this man's disciples? He saith, I am not. And the servants and officers stood there, who had made a fire of coals, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves, and Peter stood with them and warmed himself. Beginning the section of Peter's denial of the Christ, and we made several points of application with that last week, and how it is that when we're reading through this, we might have feelings of indignation, consternation, anger, disappointment, sadness when it comes to this event with Peter. But we raised the question about, well, what about sympathy? What about empathy and being able to relate to what it is that Peter's dealing with as he's going through and making this denial? And we made reference to the fact that while there is all of this confusion that's going on in the mind of Peter, and how it was the case that the Lord had already said to him, well, you are going to do this, you are going to deny me, I am going to die. And now here Jesus is, he's in the hands of his enemies, these who despise him and hate him. But in the midst of all of this, we made the point last week on how it is the case that, well, even though Peter is about to do this, Peter still is following Jesus at this point. Even though many people think that it's the Apostle John who brought Peter in. Last week we discussed how I don't believe that to be the case. But even if it, let's say if it is not the case, well, then Peter is the only apostle that is still following while everybody else has decided to run away. And the only thing that you would have as a motivation for that is that Peter is following because he has the kind of love that would not allow Peter to desert the Lord. Now, granted, he is going to deny him at a moment of weakness, but he is still showing strength, if you will, in that he's willing to follow Jesus up to this point. So that brings us over to verse 19, where we transition from watching Peter in these scenes to now we're transitioning over to the Christ. So the high priest then asked Jesus of his disciples and of his doctrine. Now, here we have another occasion as to why this procession, you really cannot call it a trial, because everything that they're doing about it in it is illegal. And this is another point where they are in the moment trying to make a case and build their case by having Jesus speak for himself so as to potentially entrap himself. Even in our modern laws, which are based, majority of them are based off of biblical laws, I am not in a position to where I have to speak for myself and end up being in a position where I incriminate myself. That's why we have the, being able to plead the Fifth Amendment. I do not have to say or deny anything that might incriminate me in a court of law. Well, they're breaking that law with Jesus right here. He's not having to speak for himself. Where's his defense? Where is his lawyer, if you will? But when they're raising this question, they should already, as we said, they should have already made the case and had their witnesses ready so as to back up the case that they are trying to establish. But what's really going on here is what's stated in John 11:48, in that they are afraid of losing their position. If we allow this man to continue doing these mighty works, Rome is going to come in and they're going to remove us from our power and our position. And they're more interested in his disciples as to, well, how many do you actually have? We're interested in knowing the ones that are following Christ, because that means they're not following us. And they're interested in that more than his doctrine. And that's important because people have the tendency, as we've seen with the Pharisees throughout the entire ministry of Christ, they're constantly weighing their actions based upon, well, how much favor does he have with the people at this time? How do the people actually feel about him? So if we take hold of him now, are the people going to be on our side, or are they actually going to be in a position to beat us back, if you will? And there are plenty of illustrations that we could pull from in our modern times of where even members of the Lord's church, our own brethren, behave in that kind of manner. I can remember in the past, my dad talking about going to different places and trying to raise funds for the work in Virginia. And when he would go into certain congregations where there might be an association with, say, for example, Memphis School of Preaching, and at the time the director of that school was Curtis Cates, that if my dad had enough pull inside of the congregation, well, Memphis would not cause a stink with that congregation. However, if he went to another congregation and Memphis had more respect and more pull in that congregation, well, then they would make a stink, and that congregation would not be willing to support the work that was going on in Virginia. Well, if you're going to make a stink over here, why not make a stink over here? Well, if you're going to be consistent and you're going to be just, then you should. But that's where politics, and we made the connection last week on how the office of the high priest had become a political tool that these individuals were using, and not actually a position of holiness and righteousness that God had intended it to be. So there's plenty of application as to, the trial of Jesus. Some might say, well, we'll never be in that situation ever again. What we're learning here is character. These are lessons on psychology. What makes people tick? Why do they behave the way that they do? Why are they doing this here? Why are you asking about my disciples? Well, because we want to know how many allies you have. Is this the time for us to act, or are we still needing to wait as far as to the favoritism of the people? But then to the point of his doctrine. And Jesus has an interesting answer when he's giving a defense here for them questioning about his doctrine. Jesus answered him, I spake openly to the world. I ever taught in the synagogue and in the temple, whither the Jews always resort, and in secret have I said nothing. Why askest thou me? Ask them which heard me what I have said unto them. Behold, they know what I said. So, in other words, what Jesus is laying out here, the question he's raising in his answer, what do you mean, what is my doctrine? I have been teaching out in the open for 3.5 years now, in the synagogues. That is a very public and open place where religious discussions are being had. It's a place where prayers wanting to be made. In the temple, it does not get any more public and obvious than the heart of Jewish religion and the temple that's in Jerusalem. So he's been in the temple, he's been out on the coast, he's been out in the wilderness. And then if you remember, even in the synagogues, coasts, and the wilderness, and especially in the temple, the Jews are always present at these events. There's not anywhere that Jesus is going and doing his teaching that Jews are not following him. Even when he was in the wilderness in John chapter 5 or John chapter 6, you have Jews traveling up from Jerusalem out into the wilderness where he is so as to see what he's teaching. They're always around to hear what's being said. And then he makes the point, why are you asking me? If I've presented and taught and preached this so openly and so publicly in all these places, why are you taking the time to ask me? Go and ask my witnesses that heard me. Behold, they know what I said. So for Jesus to say to this high council and to this court, well, you can go ask my witnesses. That is a very sharp answer that Jesus is giving at this time, because the Pharisees or the high priest at this point, they have no witnesses. And Jesus knows that they do not have any witnesses. So here they are trying to build a case with no witnesses, and Jesus says, oh, by the way, you can go ask the multitude of my witnesses what I've taught. And thus that ends up bringing in the response that we have from the Jews at this time in verse 22. And when he had thus spoken, one of the officers which stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Answerest thou the high priest so? Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil, but if well, why smitest thou me? Now Annas had sent him bound unto Caiaphas the high priest. Can you imagine? Put yourself in this scene. Or just even move it into our modern day. And you had Jesus in a court of law. And he made a statement like this. He gives an answer back to the judge in this kind of fashion. And the bailiff just walks up and slaps him across the face. Just shock and awe that we would express, because that's not lawful. That's not just for you to do that. What evil? What did he say wrong? How did he break the law here? Here is a hostile response being given to a very simple answer to a very simple question. Now, this proves a few things. One, it shows just how their minds were already made up. Their minds were so made up that they were ready to kill him. We're going to kill him. That's all there is to it. That means anything that Jesus is going to answer, that he's going to say, really does not matter. And it goes further to show how they really have nothing to accuse him of. You see, they don't make the accusation. They're asking him questions. They're trying to make him say it. They do not have enough boldness to go ahead and lay out very clearly, okay, yeah, here's what you did wrong. Well, that's not just. If you've got an accusation, you need to make it. And I can remember a situation where we were in Jamaica and we were dealing with a congregation there. We were helping them with a gospel meeting / vacation Bible school that they were doing. They were brethren that believed in the head covering. Well, the women that we had with us were not going to wear a covering. We got into I did a sermon about it and made a point of mentioning that and how that we shouldn't be binding that kind of thing. That then resulted in the preacher and some of the members there of that congregation pulling us into a meeting about that point. And they, at the end of it, they tried to say, well, we're not going to have you guys help us with the vacation Bible school, and it's fine if you don't want to help us. And I spoke up and I said, no, wait a minute. We're not the ones with an issue here. We're not the ones trying to bind this tradition as though it's a God-given law. That's your position. So if you truly hold to your position, then you should be saying to us, we do not want your help because you're not following this. See what he was trying to do? He was trying to push all the blame over to us as though we were the troublemakers and it wasn't anything to do with them. But when I laid it out to him that way, the preacher said, yes, you're right. We do not want your help. And we said, okay, that's fine. And we left. And then also, just to the further point of them not having a case, they're trying to grasp onto anything that they can. They have no accusation to make against him, so what do they try to do? Oh, look at him. Look at how he answered the high priest. See how disrespectful he is. See how blasphemous he is. Well, since he spoke this way to the high priest, then that then means he's blasphemous towards God. Now, we look at that and we would say, oh, that's really weak. That's really pathetic. But brethren will try to do this too. Any little mistake that you make in your argumentation, even though it's for example, a mistake in the details and not actually a real flaw to your accusation that you're making. And they'll want to jump on that. And he said, well, you said it happened on a Monday, but it really happened on a Tuesday. Okay, I got confused as to what day it was. What does that actually have to do with whether or not this brother lied if it was a Monday or a Tuesday? If he lied on Monday, or if it was a Tuesday, it doesn't matter. He still lied. And that's what brethren will do. And I can even remember during the situation going on in Virginia where my dad tried to do that very thing. We're in the midst of all this turmoil and all this division that he and my little brother had caused. And I went back to the Martinsville building to drop off my cars. And while I was there, or before I got in there, he had already called up one of the former elders down in Portland, Texas. I didn't know that he had done that. He comes out of the building as I'm walking back home because I don't have a car anymore. And he pulls me into the building and he says, I've got this elder on the phone and we're ready to talk about this. And I said, fine, but I need to go home so as to get my evidence of everything that's transpired. And immediately as I said that, my dad jumped on that opportunity and he said, did you hear that, brother? He's wanting to have you, an elder, wait around on him. That's how it went, and I'm pretty sure I've got it recorded somewhere. How weak of an argument is that, and how desperate are you to try to build a case of your innocence and your justification that for me to request, and I didn't just say, wait for me to go home, I asked, because it was an elder, so I'm trying to be respectful, and I asked. I said, brother, can I go home and grab my information and come back and talk to you? And he immediately jumped on and tried to, spin it in this thing of, well, you see there, the arrogance, he just wants you to wait on him. As we're saying, all of this, I don't know which side I'm needing to point here. I think it's actually over here. Let me go to my OBS so I can make sure my pointing is correct. Yeah, nope, I was doing it right. It's over here. Here we have, these things are happening in the first century, but we're still gaining plenty of application for what's going on today. The reason why that is because times change, but people do not. So they have nothing to accuse him of, taking hold of the littlest thing, and Jesus makes clear that his answer was not sinful. Hey, if I've done something wrong, bear witness of the evil. Tell it to me, explain it to me. If not, then you're in the wrong for striking at me this way and even trying to take opportunity to make a false accusation like this. It's also important for us to note just the calmness that Jesus has in the midst of this. Now, remember where we are. We have moved from Annas, where I believe we're still in his mansion. We're not actually in the chamber of the high priest. We're at Annas' mansion. We've moved from him. We're now in front of the high priest, quote unquote, Caiaphas. And it's a private trial, middle of the night, with no one in authority to actually be involved in doing this. Nobody is seeing what's going on. And just imagine how you would be reacting in this situation. I know if it were me, it'd be pure panic. And I more than likely would be yelling at the top of my lungs, just trying to get anybody to hear me and come and try to help in the midst of this. But we see with Jesus, there's this calmness all throughout it, clear-headed in giving his answers, calm, cool, collective, just cool as a cucumber. And that's an important element for us to take into consideration with this. And that as we're learning about what people will do, that will help us to be better prepared if and when we find ourselves in these kind of situations. So we have been set for us a contrast between Peter being asked questions and called on the carpet and how he reacts, to how Jesus in his trial and being called on the carpet and how he reacts. With Peter, there's confusion and chaos and turmoil, and that causes him to answer in ways that he shouldn't. Whereas with Jesus, there's a calmness, there's a collectiveness, and he's answering just as he should. Now, verse 25 transitions back over to Peter in the midst of all these events. Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. They said, therefore, unto him, art not thou also one of his disciples? He denied it and said, I am not. One of the servants of the high priest, being his kinsman, whose ear Peter cut off, saith, did not I see thee in the garden with him? Peter then denied again, and immediately the cock crew. Just as we said, look at the contrast. How Jesus is answering, very direct, to the point, some sharp answers being given, but not doing anything wrong. Here's Peter, and he is denying all the way through. And even to the point where, and this is really where it gets amazing, that in verse 26, here is one of the relatives to the man that Peter cut off his ear in the garden. And even he is questioning him. Hey, didn't I see you in the garden with him? Aren't you one of his disciples? And Peter is still going to deny. And just in watching this, you've got to be thinking to yourself, well, whoa, Peter, slow down. Are you really going to try to get away from this? He was there. He saw you. And this, and he's bringing up and he's raising the question. Well, he doesn't even ask about cutting off the ear. Just the fact that, well, yeah, that's my cousin, and you went to whacking at his ear. And you're still thinking that you can get away from this. Now put yourself in Peter's shoes. We were just a moment ago looking at Jesus and saying, well, put yourself there. How would you handle it? How would you handle this? Now, I'm not trying to excuse what Peter did. but I am wanting to understand it. Because in understanding what's transpiring here, I can learn from it. And I can be prepared when I find myself in situations like this. The pressure is building. You've gone from the damsel asking you, and you denied there. Well, okay, I can get away with this because she wasn't even there. She really has no idea who I am. I'm in the clear here. You get around this fire, excuse me, and you warm yourself, and somebody else asks you, well, aren't you one of his disciples? Well, okay, I can still get away from this. This is, this is getting a little bit closer, but I can still get away from it because they really don't know. But then you get yourself in a situation where there is no getting away from this. Here's an eyewitness that saw you there standing in defense of Jesus. The pressure is building. That's causing agitation. And now Peter's backed in a corner. He has no way out. Now, granted, he put himself in the corner. He started heading towards that corner when he first denied to the damsel. He should have owned up to it there and just said, well, yes, I am a disciple. And just let the chips fall where they will. Could have been they would have kicked him out. Could have been they might have tried to arrest him. Could have been he said yes and then was able to run away. But instead he goes down this path of trying to deny. And now here he is where he's got himself so deep that the only way to preserve himself is to deny. Now it's good for us to think about Peter's denial and what has led up to it, so as to better understand what's transpiring here. And one of the first things that we note is how Peter failed to listen to what Jesus said. Now, he heard what Jesus said, but he wasn't believing of it. Jesus had already said, Peter, you're going to deny me. And this may be, in Peter's mind, it's the idea, well, no, this may be somebody else's problem, but this won't be me. And in this situation of not listening, part of the reason why he was not listening was because he was too confident, overly confident. Now, it's good to be confident, but you're not needing to be so overly confident that you end up pushing yourself over your skis, if you will, and then you end up taking a tumble. It's a hard lesson for everybody to learn, to not be too confident and to listen discreetly. And it's dangerous for us not to learn this and to think, oh, well, I would never do, and you can fill in the blank. Or to go to the other side of it, oh, I will surely do, and then just fill in the blank. Here Peter's in both categories. I'll never deny you. And then he goes a step further and says, I will die with you. Well, you're not really sure as to what you're going to do until the situation arises. Or you have been playing this scenario in your mind over and over and over again to where you are actually prepared for the situation and you can stand when the situation arises. Putting myself here, I don't know what I would have done. More than likely, I might not have made it past the damsel at the door. She were to ask me, hey, aren't you one of his disciples? I might have just turned around right then and went back home. Or it could have been the case I deny all 3 times right there at the gate. No, I'm not. No, I'm not. No, I'm not. Before I even make it into the interior. We need to be considerate of where we actually are in our growth and in our faith before we start over-surmising or overestimating, rather, what we're actually capable of. I mean, you may have the desire to do certain things. You might have that zeal that we talked about last week, but lacking the knowledge of how to actually do it or being in a position where you can actually do that thing, you might be setting yourself up for some trouble. And then one of the obvious things is Peter being afraid. We've discussed it many times in our classes and even our sermons, how fear is a powerful emotion. Now, it's powerful for the good in some situations because the emotion of fear is what keeps us out of trouble, keeps us away from danger, and keeps us from getting harmed. So as far as it affecting us in many ways, there are positive ways that fear can affect us. But then there's also the negative, and that's what we're seeing here with Peter. Being afraid And not listening, being overly confident, and all of those things coming together creates a perfect storm for fear to cause us to do the things that we shouldn't. And even with that, with fear causes us to actually causes us to become immobile. With most people, and you hear them in their discussions about, well, I was so afraid at this point and that I just froze. And that's what we find with fear most of the time in the Bible, is that it causes inactivity. You take the one talent man that went and hid his talent in the ground. He did not do anything with it. He was inactive with what his master had given to him. And why? He was afraid. So I didn't try. So we need to be mindful of this emotion of fear. Okay, it's good, it's useful, but it does not need to overrun us to where we become inactive and where we're not willing to stand for the right things of God. So what is the remedy to fear? Ultimately, there is only one remedy to fear, and that's going to be the element of faith. Faith, trust, belief in God and His promises is the only thing that's going to help us be able to overcome this emotion that's within us to be afraid. And throughout the Bible, you find these two elements, faith and fear, oftentimes being mentioned together in the same verse. Psalm 56 and verse 3. What time I am afraid. Okay, so there's our element of fear. What's the remedy? I will trust in thee. Psalm 56:11. In God have I put my trust. I will not be afraid what man can do unto me. Now, in both of these texts, you can very easily substitute for the word trust. You can put in this place faith. I will have faith in thee. In God I have put my faith. I will not be afraid. When I am afraid, and that's an important point, because here in verse 3, here is the psalmist saying, okay, I'm here. I'm in the emotion of fear. I am afraid. Okay, nothing wrong with that. Absolutely nothing wrong with being afraid. But at some point, you've got to shift that fear over into faith. So for Peter in this situation, his faith has fled and fear has stepped in. And we've seen this with Peter before. Matthew chapter 14, verse 28 through 31, stepping out of the boat, walking on water, took his eyes off Jesus, saw the winds and the waves, began to sink. But again, as we said with Peter in this situation, he's following. And in that situation, Matthew 14, Peter got out of the boat. When fear grips my heart, when fear grips your heart, we need to stop and ask, what can I do to raise my faith so as to be able to replace this feeling of fear? And that's where the scriptures come in. That's where reading situations like what Peter's going through and watching him, and especially to watch where we're fixing to go here in a moment with the outcome and how the scriptures are going to point out how God reacts to Peter's denial. All of these things are to establish in our minds and give us a steadfast hope of the promises and the comfort that God is granting to us through His scriptures, and we need to allow that to chase away that fear. Then we have the element of peer pressure. So Peter's not listening, overly confident, being afraid, and then you add peer pressure into the midst of that. We live in a world of unbelief and full of unbelievers. And that tears down our faith. And a lot of that comes from a lack of understanding. And oftentimes we find ourselves like Peter in this situation where we're having to stand alone against the multitudes, against all these people that are in our realm of influence that are, we're trying to have influence on them. They're trying to have influence on us. And it's difficult to have the mindset and an attitude of Daniel and his 3 friends as they've been taken into captivity in Babylon. Okay, you've taken from your homeland. You've been removed from your religious leaders, removed from your family. You are removed from all your friends. So pretty much all of the people that would be watching over you to make sure that you are following through with the laws of God. So you're out here on your own. You pretty much can do whatever you want to, and nobody's going to know. Who's going to tell on you anyways? You're in a foreign land full of strangers. So what's the big deal if you go off and do whatever it is that you're wanting to do? Even with Peter here, okay, I believe none of the other apostles are there. So who's going to know if I deny? Who's going to know what I said? Well, thankfully, we have the Holy Spirit giving revelation through inspiration to John and the other writers to record what we have here. And that's an important note too. God's always watching. God's always taking a record. So that's the situation here with Daniel and his 3 friends and everybody else taken into Babylonian captivity. God's still watching. God's still mindful of what you're doing. And so what we're needing is that attitude that Daniel and his 3 friends have, as recorded in Daniel 1:8. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. We have to have it already settled in our mind. I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to defile myself. And when we have that settled in our minds, it's no longer a choice. It's not even an option. It's just a knee-jerk reaction. Nope, not going to do that. So when we're thinking about, even from this point of peer pressure, that brings into view a need to recognize the separation of location of where Peter is to where Jesus is. So here's Peter, and he's on the outside warming himself, and he's around in this crowd. Jesus is on the inside going through his trial and dealing with the high priest. Just imagine for a moment. What if Peter had been right beside Jesus when all of this was happening? What do you think Peter would have said in those situations? He's shoulder to shoulder with Jesus, and the people are coming up to him saying, "Oh, are you one of his disciples?" Probably he would not have denied. With Jesus right there, he would have owned up to it. But he's not there. They are separated. Jesus is not here to help you. What are you going to do? And that is a difficult spot to be in. And up to this point, and this was brought up in our class, I'm going to be able to remember some things. This was brought up in our class on, up to this point. Peter has walked lockstep, side by side with Jesus, always there to give direction, always there to give guidance. And even in the times where Peter does make a mess, like when they come asking him about Jesus paying the temple tax, "Well, does your master pay tax?" And Peter answers, "Oh, yeah, he pays tax." Okay, Peter made a mess right there, and who was there to clean it up? Jesus was. Well, go down, catch a fish, take that money out of the fish's mouth, and go pay the tax. Well, now, Jesus isn't there to help you. He's not there to defend you. He's not there to clean up your mess. Now, what are you going to do? When we stand in a collective, when we stand in a group that is like-minded as we are and shares in the same beliefs, it's easy to then stand boldly. Or, let's say you're not even the one standing boldly, it's easy to stand behind somebody else that's being bold. But what about when you are called to stand alone? Are you going to have the boldness and the conviction to stand strong even when the opposition is all around you? We're seeing with Jesus, okay, he's doing that very thing. But here's Peter with all of his big talk, thinking that he's ready to do that. Now the test comes, and he's falling short. And friends, that's just the experiences of life. And that's the next, element that we took the time to discuss in our class, in just discussing the experiences of life. What do you notice about these scenarios where Peter ends up denying? He enters the gate and there's a damsel. It's cold, so there's a crowd of people gathered around a fire so as to warm themselves. And then there's the relative of the person that you cut off his ear that was also in the garden. Anything special, anything extraordinary about those kind of events? Oh, there's just a girl at the gate. There's these guys or this group warming themselves around a fire, and you ran into the kinsfolk of the guy you cut his ear off. There's nothing special or mysterious or miraculous about these happenings. These are just ordinary, everyday events. And that is a point on how the little things of life end up becoming trials and tests for us. These ordinary events, seemingly insignificant. Damsel at the door. Cold, so I go by the fire. They were all tests. I'm sure Peter was never expecting, okay, this girl right here, she's gonna test me, she's gonna try me. No, there's a gate, there's a gatekeeper. There's customary for her to be there. These guys warming themselves, okay, yeah, it's cold. They're going to be over there warming themselves. Peter's not thinking, well, if I go over there with them, they're going to ask me, well, are you a disciple? Never dreamed that. And that's how it goes for us too. It's the little unexpected things that as we go through our daily routines that actually end up becoming tests for us. All right, am I going to stand for my convictions in this moment? Or am I going to deny and go along with whatever it is that they're doing? Now, had Peter had the time or even taken the time to stop and to think, he might have done differently. And a lot of the times that's what gets us into trouble. We're impulsive. Knee-jerk reaction, in the moment, reacting. If Peter had stopped and recognized, wow, Jesus said I was going to deny. Now here I am in a position of where I'm either going to have to affirm him or deny him. What am I going to do? More than likely, he would not have denied. But he's not thinking about that. It's not even coming into his mind. And now he's in the moment with these little events. Well, that's the way it is for us too. You go to work and one of your coworkers makes a crass joke. What are you going to do in that moment? You going to laugh? Are you going to go along with the group? Or are you going to give some kind of look of disdain, disgust? That's not funny. Or are you going to leave the room? And this is part of the conversation that we had in our Bible study today and asking, what is a proper response to a situation like that? What should you say? And my response was, a lot of the times you do not have to say anything. Just the fact of you're not reacting the way that they want or expect you to react with them telling, a gross story or being vulgar or what have you, or talking or even gossiping, talking about other coworkers, whatever the case may be. If they are sensitive to what's going on and what others are doing, then they might recognize, oh, well, Micah didn't laugh. And with me, in my situation, with my secular work and my other employment that I have alongside of teaching and preaching, there are individuals that I'm around, they have the tendency of getting raunchy from time to time. Well, my practice has been, whenever that starts, I leave the room. Well, guess what's now happened? Because I've done that enough. They've all recognized, without me even having to say anything, that I'm not in favor of what they're saying. So now, whenever I come into the room, they say it halfway jokingly, but I believe that there's a portion of sincerity, because now when I enter the room, they start cleaning things up. Oh, it's kind of a joke. Oh, here's Micah. We need to, we don't need to talk about this. And everybody kind of chuckles, and I'll chuckle along with them. But then the next thing you know, whatever they were talking about has stopped, and they transition over to something else. So right there, without me even having to say anything, hey, you shouldn't be talking like that or what have you, it's changing the atmosphere. They're recognizing, well, okay, if we want Micah to be around and if we want Micah to be comfortable, then here's how we need to be. Now, and part of that has to do with the fact that they know that I'm a preacher, and so we need to have respect and reverence for the preacher, but they really need to be having more respect and reverence for God in the room. Not that I'm God, but the fact of what we mentioned before with Peter. God's watching. God's listening. It doesn't matter if I hear you. I'm not the one that's going to be casting out or dealing out punishment or judgment. You really should be more concerned of the fact that well, God's listening and he's taking note of what you're saying, and especially while you're claiming to be Christians. But then we come to, while looking at all of these negative things, we come to Peter's redemptive quality throughout all of this. And Peter's redemptive quality throughout his life is that he learns from his mistakes. And Peter grows from those mistakes. This is not going to be the last mistake that Peter makes. After Jesus ascends to heaven and Peter's given the keys of the kingdom and he preaches the first sermon on the day of Pentecost and he stands before the high priest himself. So here he is at this stage, not ready to stand before the high priest, but just a few days later, 50 days later, where's Peter going to be? He's going to be right there in the same place that Jesus was, before the high priest, giving a defense. See how fast it happens? Short period of time, 50 days. But then after that, he ends up running into some trouble when it comes to, well, what are we supposed to do with the Gentiles? He runs into a problem that when he's with Gentiles, everything's fine. But then when some respectable people come from Jerusalem, when James comes from Jerusalem, Peter starts wanting to distance himself from these Gentiles. There's that peer pressure element once again creeping in. But he learns from that also. And it's not easy for us to learn from our mistakes. Jordan is reading a book by an author's last name is Maxwell, might be John Maxwell, I'm not sure. And the book is titled, Sometimes You Win, Sometimes You Learn. And that's a play on our phrase about, well, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. But he's changing that from the aspect of, well, yeah, sometimes you do win, but even when you lose, that's, this is an opportunity for you to learn and to grow. Why did I make those mistakes? And that's what's going on with Peter, and that's what we need to work on. And thankfully, Peter is not a lobster. Now, this is one area where I wish we had not lost our footage from before, because when I brought up this slide, there's a lot of confused looks in the audience just because they're not reading or listening to Jordan Peterson. So we had a bit of fun with this illustration. If you know anything about Jordan Peterson and some of his lessons and his 12 rules for life, he has this long section that everybody jokes about lobster lessons. And while it is funny, it is a very good lesson, because in the lobster world, you have those lobsters that are more dominant and the ones that are more weak. And what's interesting as to which is which, well, the two lobsters end up having a conflict and a fight for dominance and who's going to be in charge of the group. Well, when these lobsters fight, of course, the one that wins becomes more confident and he'll grow larger so as to attract mates and so on and so forth. But the lesson is really more about the lobster that loses. And that the lobster that loses the fight continuously grows weaker until eventually he just dies out. And the reason for that is because he's lost that fight and he carries that loss with him all the way through. What Dr. Peterson is doing is he's making the connection between lobsters and human beings. There are people that are like this too. That they go through some trial, they go through some temptation, and they fall short. They make a mistake. They sin. Well, do they repent of it, confess of it, shake themselves off and get back up and keep on moving? No. They're like a lobster that's been beat. They just carry that loss around with them all the time, growing weaker and weaker and weaker and becoming more aggressive and more agitated and more displaced because, I'm down here and here's this bigger lobster that's up here. And we're not needing to be that way. Peter's not that way. Even as he denies the Lord, he's going to be the one to preach the first sermon on the day of Pentecost. What an honor. But you see, Peter's not ready for that yet. Just like Moses in slaying the Egyptian. Well, Acts tells us, Stephen tells us in the book of Acts by inspiration, that Moses knew that there was something special about where he was and what he was doing. He knew that he was going to be the one to deliver out of Egypt. But the time was not, when he killed that Egyptian, it was not the time. So then he had to go and run and hide in the wilderness for 40 years as a shepherd. Now, Moses found himself in a bit of a position as to what we're discussing here, that when God did end up calling him to do the work he wanted him to do, Moses tried to make excuses. Well, I'm not able to speak. I'm not this and I'm not that. See, he's a beat up lobster at that point. And God finally has to get started with him and says, look, I'm sending you and you're going. I'm going to help you. So on and so forth. Peter is not in a position where he's ready to lead. He's got to learn some lessons about himself first, and that is, okay, you're going to mess up. What are you going to do when you mess up? Are you going to own up to it? Are you going to fix it? Or are you going to mope around, wimp around, and be like this lobster? These mistakes, these shortcomings, these sins that we commit, they contribute to our growth. We need them in our lives. They help to bring experience to our lives, to look at the event and to question, well, how could I have done this differently? And that's part of the problem. We don't like to look back on it because it hurts to look back on it. Oh, we made a mistake. I don't like the way I felt. Okay, that's fine. But analyze it. What happened? Where did I lose sight? Where did I lose focus? What could I have said here? So on and so forth. All these different kind of things. And we see with Peter that he did not blame the circumstances. Well, Jesus, you just have no idea. You just don't know how hard that was in being confronted by that little girl. Can you imagine Peter trying to say that to Jesus when he's standing before the high priest? Yeah, Peter, I just have no idea what you were going through. And even consider further. Peter was confused. He's alone, trying to follow Jesus, follow him through this the best that he could. And the pressure's being placed on him. The pressure's just building up all around him. And yet, he does not make any excuse on any of that. None of that. And he does not blame the damsel or anyone else involved in questioning him. He does not play the victim. He recognizes and he takes upon himself, okay, yeah, I made a mistake. I messed up here. And that's a very crucial element when we're considering in this, and that there is a redemptive arc. And we need to allow ourselves that opportunity. That while, okay, I may not be at the place where I should be, am I working on that redemptive arc? That's going to bring me into that position. When we can take into consideration what the other gospel accounts have to say on this matter, Luke brings a little bit of extra detail in here as to the denial that takes place. Luke 22 and verse 60. Peter said, Man, I know not what thou sayest. And immediately while he yet spake, the cock crew. And the Lord turned and looked upon Peter, and Peter remembered the word of the Lord. Now he had said unto him, Before the cock crow, thou shalt deny me thrice. And Peter went out and wept bitterly. So here we have more information on how close Peter was to Jesus in this scene. He was close enough that Jesus could see him, to turn and look at him, make eye contact. Even possibly able to hear the vehement and strong denial fall from Peter's lips at that point. And we know that Peter got pretty animated with his denial with the records that we have in Matthew and Mark. But this brings in a question that we discussed in our Bible class hour. How do you think God felt toward Peter after this betrayal? What kind of emotions do you think were in that stare, in that look that Christ gave to Peter at that moment? Well, it could be that there was some disappointment, some hurt, and some sadness, maybe even some indignation, if you would, a little bit of anger, frustration. How could you do this, Peter? Could be. But I know for sure, from what I know of the other scriptures that we have to go along with this account, that was Luke 22, 60 through 62. When you go back to Luke 22, 31 through 34, and we read about the conversation between Peter and Jesus before the denial, the Lord said, Simon, Simon, behold, Satan hath desired to have you, that he may sift you as wheat. But I have prayed for thee, that thy faith fail not. And when thou art converted, strengthen thy brethren. And he said unto him, Lord, I am ready to go with thee both into prison and to death. And he said, I tell thee, Peter, the cock shall not crow this day before that thou shalt thrice deny that thou knowest me. Here's what I know of a certainty of how Jesus felt about Peter even after the denial, in looking at him and hearing him make the denial. There was care and there was concern. That as Jesus looked on Peter, it was a look that said, do not let your faith fall. God is on our side. He wants us to succeed. And even with all of this, Jesus says very clearly, Peter, I know what's coming. I know what's coming for you. So when it happens, okay, there's no shock. There's no amazement. There's no, Jesus isn't clutching his pearls. Oh, Peter, how could you? He knows what we're going to do. And in knowing what we're going to do, here's the hope that he has for us. He's prayed for you. He's prayed for Peter. He's making intercession for us. And what is his desire? Don't give up. Yes, you've fallen here, but do not give up. Do not let your faith fall. And you contrast the denial of Peter to the betrayal of to Judas. And you have the fact that, okay, as we said, there's that redemptive quality. What separates them? Why is it that Peter's in the position that he is? And here's what we remember about Judas, which this is an interesting point and a good point about those that might be considering suicide, taking your own life. If you do that, that's all people are going to remember you by and remember you for. Because that is a truly selfish act that's going to blemish and diminish any other things good things that you might have done in your life. All that's going to be remembered. Well, Judas is the one that went out and hung himself. But yet, there's the contrast. Peter corrected his mistakes. Peter had that godly sorrow. Judas had that sorrow of the world. Let's talk about this contrast in 2 Corinthians 7 and verse 10. Peter was overtaken by unseen snares, while Judas went in with his eyes wide open to what he was doing. Peter fell through weaknesses of his flesh, not things that were premeditated. He's not planning any of this out like what Judas was doing. It was purely an impulse of the moment, not by deliberate planning. And thus Peter ends up becoming a very good illustration of what Paul would write about, what he will end up writing about in Galatians chapter 6 and verse 1. Brethren, if any of you be overtaken in a fault, you which are spiritual, go and restore that one. The phrase to be overtaken in a fault carries with it the idea of an animal that's caught in a trap. Okay, you're not looking for it. You're just going on your merry way, and you see a piece of bait that's there. You see something there that's to entice you. You don't know that it's on a trap. You go towards it, and the trap springs, and now you're in it. And that's where Peter is. He is trying to follow Christ. And look what's happening as you're trying to follow Christ. Is everything easy? Is everything going to go your way? No. There are snares out there. There are traps out there, even as you're trying to walk after the Savior. You got to be mindful of that. You got to be vigilant. And if you find yourself falling into a trap, do not be afraid to cry for help. Just as with Peter, walking on the water begins to sink, and he cried out. And there was the Lord, reached down and helped him. Here's the Lord now, after Peter's denied, and he looks at him. That was not a look of criticism, it was a look of help. Do not give up. And that's the point that we reached in our Bible class time. We'll stop there so as to keep the continuity going, and we'll pick up looking at some more points about Peter's denial and what could have happened in the midst of this, so that we're able to gain as much application, much mental preparedness for any of the trials that might be in front of us. Hope that you've enjoyed this time together. If you have any questions or comments, please put those down in the comments section. sure to leave a like and share with others that you think would be benefited and helped by this information. And we look forward to seeing you back next time for live episodes of the Back to the Bible broadcast, but then also as we move forward in our John study. Hope that you're stay tuned for that. So thank you for watching, and have a great day.